be here again with you this morning. This morning, we are having a song study, which I failed to mention to our song leader, which is my fault, so I'll take the responsibility for that. But we're going to take a look this morning at the song, Have Thine Own Way. So if you want to open up in your songbook to that, that would be number 169. So 169. And we'll take a look in a minute at some of the lyrics there, but we'll talk about some of the background of this song and also how it applies to us once we've learned a few things about it. To start out with, let me say that in life, things do not always go the way that we want. I don't know if you've noticed that yet in life, but a lot of times it just doesn't happen the way we think it should. And sometimes that's through our own fault, sometimes that's through no fault of our own. And sometimes it's not necessarily that it doesn't happen, it just doesn't happen at the pace that we want it to. And we can get frustrated by that. As an example of this, and I get to use a whole new world of examples now because I have a child. And the example comes from him, and this was about a week and a half ago, I guess, which, is half of his lifetime. But he was upset about something. So Elias was upset about something. We didn't know what it was. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't too hot. He wasn't too cold. He wasn't wet. He didn't need anything as far as we could tell. So we're trying to comfort him. And eventually, as he's crying, we decide, well, okay, maybe we'll take off his hat. Of all things, we take off his hat, and in mid-cry, he stops. And is as content as possible. Now, why did that happen? Because something was not going the way that he wanted, and it was something totally out of his control, but as soon as it was changed, then he was happy. But in our lives, things will not always go as we want them to, and a lot of times they are out of our power to control. But they are within God's power. And when we look at this song that we're going to this morning, again, number 169, Have Thine Own Way, we will see that it is God who is in control and should be in control, and even to the exclusion of ourselves and our own wishes and plans, taking the front seat there. So, looking at this song. The song was written in 1902 by Adelaide Pollard, who we'll talk about in just a second, but 1902 was a little while ago. It was a long time ago, actually. It was longer maybe than we even think, just to give us some reference points of what was happening at that time. Number one, Teddy Roosevelt was president. That's been a little while since that took place. At the same time, in 1902, J.C. Penney was founded. It was also the first Rose Bowl. The football club Real Madrid was founded that year, and the Alaska Gold Rush started. So it's been a while since this song was written, but it still has an impact even today. It was written by, like we said, Adelaide Pollard. And if you look at your book, you'll see that on the left hand there. That's the author's name as in the writer of the lyrics. Now, typically in our songbook, the other name on the right will be the composer. So we have the author of the words and then the composer of the music. And sometimes they're the same person, but a whole lot of the time they're not. And that's the case here. So what do we know about Adelaide Pollard? Well, she is a native of rural Iowa, about 2 hours out of Des Moines, and her actual name was Sarah. I guess because she was from Iowa and everything was already boring, she decided she needed to change her name to something more interesting, so she chose Adelaide. And she eventually moves to Chicago. She was born in 1862, I failed to mention, which would be the beginning time frame of the Civil War. And she moves to Chicago, she becomes a teacher. She, of course, is a Bible class teacher as well. And she becomes involved in some ministries there. Now, they aren't ministries that we would necessarily want to be involved in, but the first one she joins is a healing ministry, as in someone that goes around healing people, supposedly by God's power. And she even claimed herself to have been healed of diabetes through this work. Obviously, we would have some questions about that. But then the second ministry that she takes part in is a ministry based on preaching that Jesus' return is imminent, as in any day, which of course we say as well, but the idea here is that he's coming this year, and you need to get ready. ready. And that's the kind of preaching that was being done. So she knew how to pick him as far as ministry goes, but she did have a background in varying religious ideas. Now, the other side of this, like we said, is George Stebbins, who's the composer of the music for the song. Now, some composers have many, many songs that we're familiar with, and some don't. And he's one of the ones that we don't have a lot of familiarity with, but he does have two songs that we know. He has the song that we're reading right now, Have Thine Own Way, but also Take Time to Be Holy. And if you think for a minute about the music to both, you can hear the similarity from the same composer. So George Stebbins writes both of these. He is one of those many composers that ended up being associated with Dwight L. Moody in Chicago, as well as Ira Sankey and that whole group back then. So that is our composer. And then we also want to take a look at the inspiration for the song. Most songs have some kind of inspiration behind them, and this one is no different. So what inspired our author to write these words? She was as we said, she was involved in different ministries, but what she wanted to do, for whatever reason, she felt particularly excited to do this and felt maybe called in life to do this, but she wanted to be a missionary in Africa. And that was something at that time that was a lot more popular even than it is today to join the mission field. And she wanted specifically to go to Africa, but the problem was that she could not raise the money to do so. Now that is what we have familiarity with in our own lives, that we might want to do something, particularly financially or in some other way, but we just don't possess the means to do so. And that kind of situation can cause frustration. It did for her as well. She desperately wanted to do this mission work, but since she couldn't raise the funds, it just wasn't going to happen. And she, in her depressed state, was attending a meeting, a gospel meeting, kind of revival, and she heard the prayer of an older woman that was also at the meeting. She wasn't the one doing the meeting, but this older woman prayed, and whenever Pollard heard these words, it inspired her to write the words to this song. It's very simple, and it's on the screen here, but it's simply said, or she simply said, it really doesn't matter what you do with us, Lord, just have your way with our lives. And that's a simple enough statement, but it was a reminder for her, also a reminder for us, that when life is not going our way, or it's not going at the pace that we want it to, when we want something very badly, in this case, to go to Africa for mission work, which may not be our greatest desire, but in her case, it's exactly what she wanted. It wasn't happening. So what does she need to hear? She needs to hear, it doesn't matter what you do with this, Lord, so long as your will is done in your lives. Now, Pollard actually would get to go to Africa. Of course, I guess this was part of God's planning for her as well, but she arrived just in time for World War I, meaning that she had to leave and ended up spending the war in Scotland before coming back to the States. But her mission, her plan, her goal didn't happen the way she wanted to. But in response, she writes this hymn. Let's look at the lyrics of the song here. Starting, of course, with verse 1, starting, of course, with the first phrase in verse 1, which says, have thine own way, Lord. And it repeats, have thine own way. The whole idea of the song is really a prayer from the author to say, God, let your will be done rather than mine. Of course, that sounds a whole lot like what we hear Christ say in the garden. Luke chapter 22, verse 41. It says, and he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Anytime that life is not going quite the way that we want it to, if we would spend a few moments of reflection on the Garden of Gethsemane, things would probably start to take a different perspective. If I say, well, you know, I don't have the money to get that car that I want right now, or maybe I don't have the ability to go into the job field that I want right now, or I'm not getting that promotion, or I'm not even maybe religiously growing the way that I want to, and then we look to Christ in the garden, he says, yeah, my life's not going the way I wanted to either, but God's will be done. In this text, in verse 1 still, it says, Thou art the potter, I am the clay, mold me and make me after thy will. The illustration here is borrowed from the text that was read for us this morning, Jeremiah chapter 9, or chapter 18, sorry. And the illustration is not limited to Jeremiah chapter 18. It's also used in Isaiah. That same text in Isaiah is then quoted in Romans chapter 9. And every time it's used, it's not really on an individual basis. This is kind of an aside, but it's used on a national level. It's that Israel's plans have been frustrated, or that Israel is being molded to God's will, not necessarily us individually. But Pollard takes the liberty of making this an individual application, and it does have some way of applying to individual people if you want it to, but in the text, in the context, it is on a national level. Why do I say all that? Again, just as an aside, because it has a big factor in what people think about life being predetermined, about predestination, especially when it comes to Romans 9. But in our song here, the idea, of course, is letting God have control over us. The illustration from Jeremiah is that he goes to a potter, and the potter is making a vessel. And then the vessel is destroyed and remade into something else. The last time I was at Tater Knob Pottery in Berea, you may be familiar with it, may not, it's kind of a neat place. But I was watching a pot being made, and that's exactly what happened. It was actually a vase that was being made by the potter, and he formed the vase into the shape that he wanted, and everything was going good, and then the last step is to cut off the vase from the wheel itself. And you use a string and you draw it underneath, and it removes it from the base. But it went too high and cut through the bottom of what should have been the base of that vase. And so the pot was ruined. And so he smashed it back together, and he was going to make something else out of it later. That's the whole idea here, that the potter has total control, and that the clay is formed into whatever the potter desires for it to be. That's the kind of influence that God can and should have on us. It's the kind of influence that this song is asking for God to have on us. Not for me to try to make myself into whatever piece of pottery I want, but for God as the potter to make me whatever it is that I need to be most useful to Him. In the same concept, in the same part of this, at the end of the verse, it says, While I am waiting, yielded and still. Making pottery takes a little while. Like I said, whenever I was watching this vase being made, it took, I don't know, probably about 10 minutes of just spinning and turning and molding and shaping. In that time, it would take a little while for the clay to realize, if the clay were sentient, that it was being made into something better than just a lump of clay that it started as. But imagine if us, as the lump of clay, if we say, you know what, I don't know if I have time for this. I don't know if I have the patience. I don't know if I can wait long enough, if I can be still long enough for God to shape me into what would be useful for Him. So I think I'm actually just going to get up and just going to walk away from God. It takes a certain amount of patience for us to be molded. That process can take years for us to be shaped into what God would be most pleased by. And a lot of people get frustrated with that process and they walk away from it. But it takes time, and the prayer is that we would be willing to wait that long. In verse 2. So in verse 2, it starts out after saying, Have thine own way. It says, Search me and try me. Now that phrase may seem like nothing to you, but the phrase is inspired by another verse of Scripture. In Psalm 139, starting verse 23, it uses these words in a more drawn-out way. It says, Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. The idea of searching and trying is not just a vague notion or some random lyrics that Adelaide Pollard decided to include in this song, but instead it comes from another psalm, a psalm of the Old Testament. And the idea is to be searched out by God. And if there's anything lacking in us, if there's any evil or any wickedness within us, that it would be purged out. That's the idea here, that we would be led in a better way, but also in the song that we would be made whiter than snow. In verse 3, the last verse of the song, again after the opening statement there, it says, "Hold over my being absolute sway." Total influence, total control over everything that I do. It's absolute, 100% complete. In response to this, the question would be, in my life, what percentage of my life do I let God have influence over, and what percentage do I want to keep influence over? Maybe I let God have 40% of the control of my life, but I want to keep the majority. Or maybe I let God have the majority. Maybe He has 70% and I keep 30%. But in reality, the only thing that works is God having 100% of the control in my life. Anything else is going to have too much of my influence to work out for the best. In this same idea in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, as the pot is being made and formed into something beautiful and something useful, it should, in this illustration, start to resemble more and more of the person who made it. If that makes sense there. As God makes us into what He wants, we should look more and more like Him, to the point that eventually, once we're 100% under His sway, His absolute sway, and we should be able to say, Galatians 2:20, "I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me." As we grow more and more like Christ, we should grow less and less like ourselves. In the song, again, in the third verse here, it says, "Fill with thy Spirit, till all shall see Christ only, Christ always living in me." Again, the same concept from our verse here. Once we have given ourselves over to God, we should look just like Christ and not so much like ourselves. Or at least people should be able to see Christ clearly in us at all times. That same concept from Matthew 5:14. So, in these verses, as we look at the song, the whole song is one concept, which is, God, whatever you need to do to make my life more useful to you, that's my prayer. What do we learn from this song? There are several things that we do learn and can learn from it. Well, let's start with this one. You may or may not know, but this congregation here, Maple Avenue, is 100 years old this year, which is a long time, longer than any of us have been alive. And it is impressive that people 100 years ago, that none of us, or few of us, ever met, that they've had a lasting impact for the last 100 years. This song, in the same idea, is 119 years old. What are you going to do in your life that has an impact 100 years from now? You may say, well, there's nothing that I can do that would have that kind of impact. But there is. And maybe the impact is just that you make sure that your children and even your grandchildren are faithful, so that years from now there are still faithful Christians coming from your influence. Or maybe it's that you help the congregation where you're at to stay viable, to stay healthy, so that 100 years from now we can celebrate the 200th anniversary of this congregation. But there are things we can do. The question is, what will we do to have that kind of impact? Second thing, of course, the point of the song, when life is not going my way, how am I going to respond? When things aren't happening as quickly as I want, when things aren't happening on the timeline or in the way that I want, then what will I do in response? The easiest thing to do is to be frustrated that my plans are not succeeding. But is it more important that my plans succeed Or is it more important that when things aren't going my way, that I ask God to help me be more useful in His plans rather than my own? Maybe I can't do things that I want to individually, but what can I do for God even while I'm waiting on something to happen? Another point is that we are people of dependency. We are dependent on God. As much as we may hate to admit that we're dependent on anyone else, we like the feeling of independence, we need God. We need His influence even more so than our own if our lives are going to turn out well. Another question: if I pray, when I pray, what does my prayer sound like? Maybe break it down into percentages, but when I pray, do I pray mostly for myself? The answer is yes, every time. Do I pray mostly about the things in my life? Certainly do. But how much of my prayer is spent asking that God's will would be done in my life? I might say, Lord willing, or if the Lord wills, and that's nice. It's a nice sentiment. But how much of my prayer is what this song deals with? How much of my prayer reflects Christ's prayer in the garden? How much of what I pray says, God, you take control. Don't just help my plans to succeed, but help me to help your plans succeed. In one more question that we can ask, with a statement first, but God will make us into things that are useful to Him. He'll make us into things that are useful even in this life, but certainly most of all useful to Him. But He can only make us into what we allow Him to do. If I say, God, you're not going to have that kind of control over me, then what can we do? What will happen to us? If I said, yes, I'd like you, if I went to a potter and I said, I'd like for you to make me something. I want you to make me a vase, but you can only use one hand to do it. I'm going to limit the influence that you have over the clay. What can they do? You might be able to make something that halfway resembles a vase, but it'll never be what it was supposed to because the influence wasn't as full as it needed to be. That's the whole concept here. God will make us into what we allow Him to make us into. So the question is, what will we let God do with us? Well, this morning, if you have an answer to that question, this is the time to answer. This morning, if you can respond to this question in any way that says, I need to allow God to have more influence over me, there's more things that I need to do to be molded by Him, then let that happen this morning. Let God work on you and make you into something more useful to Him. The other beautiful thing about this passage in Jeremiah chapter 18, we stopped at verse 6 as was read for us, but in 7 and 8, it says, the instant I speak concerning a nation, as we said, it's talking about nations, and concerning a kingdom to pluck up or to pull down and to destroy it, if that nation against whom I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I have thought to bring upon it. This is still part of that same illustration of the potter and the clay. It's saying if someone will relent, I won't have to reform them, but I'll just take what they're already, the point that they're already at, and I'll continue to work on them and mold them into what I want. The point is, it's never too late. It's never too late for God to mold you into what you need to be, even if it means that He has to completely crush the clay back into a ball and start all over. That's okay, because God can do that. This morning, what will you allow God to do for you? If there's anything we can do for you, we ask that you come forward now as we stand and as we sing.